Shanghai GDG is a very interesting developer community.
I'm glad somebody has asked this question.
This is where the magic happens.
This is primarily a question and answer show. So if any of you out there would like to ask questions.
Hi everyone, welcome to Google Developers Live. I'm Ali and this is Vic, and today we're going to be talking about the Google Drive API. Specifically, we're going to give you some tips and tricks on which OAuth scopes to be using.
Yep. So we have a series of different OAuth scopes, and they have very, very different purposes. They even apply differently to different types of applications. In one scenario, you're going to need a certain scope, whereas in another scenario, you might need multiple scopes. So we're going to walk through those today. Right now on our laptop here, we're on developers.google.com/drive/scopes. I think you can see that on the screen right now. So if you take a look at this, there are currently 5 scopes that we provide to Google Drive developers. Ellie, do you want to talk about, like, high level, what the different ones are?
Yeah, so can we just mention that with the Google Documents List API, which was the API you used to use to manage these kind of files, we only had one broad scope, and these were in the infancy of OAuth and OAuth 2, so really we hadn't fleshed out what we would like. And this is one of the real improvements we've made over the Google Documents List API, so one of the reasons really to move across. The scopes themselves are, firstly, the full Drive scope. It's what we call Drive. We've got the drive.file scope. We have the drive.readonly scope and the drive.readonly.metadata scope, or metadata scope. We have another scope, those are for reading data. We have another scope that is called the drives.apps.readonly, and that relates to applications that a user has installed. We won't really be talking much about that one. We'll stick to the data scopes for now.
Yep. So the reason that we have multiple scopes, just as a reminder, is to benefit users, right? This requires an application to behave well, but really a user has to authorize less access to their files to an application. So for instance, if an application requests just the drive.readonly scope, an application is unable to manipulate the files that it has access to, but it can read all of their metadata and download each one. So this is very much less severe than the full scope, for instance.
So that's a perfect place to start. Should we start with the most restrictive scope there? That is probably the drive.readonly.metadata scope.
Yeah.
Now, there are some applications around that analyze your drive to see how much is used and where it's being used and which kind of files you're using it. These are really useful applications for yourself, and even in a domain. If you have a Google domain, you can manage that across all of it. So previously, with the Documents List API, you'd have to give that app access to do everything on your drive.
Yeah.
Now you can just say, well, I only want this app to look at the metadata for the files and not be able to change anything. Right. So very specifically, they don't need to download files, so you don't need to give that access. And users are going to be much more willing to use your application if they know that you can't modify the data.
And how does the user know that an application can't do that?
So when you first authorize an application, you get a list of what the scope can do. And this is quite a common screen. I'm sure you've seen it before, the OAuth 2 confirmation dialog. And it will say view files or list files. The more permissive scopes, they will say other stuff like, can modify files or can upload files, can download files.
Right. Exactly. So with the metadata scope, the readonly.metadata scope, you cannot download the contents of a file, which is super important to users who are concerned about maybe their confidential information leaking to certain applications.
So if you can't download the content, what can you download?
Just the title, just the description of the file. You can find out when it was last modified, when it was last updated. You can see a series of its revisions and who it's shared with, but you can't actually access the content. So that's a big deal. You can pretty much access everything that you see in the Google Drive user interface until you click to download a file, right? So that's the readonly.metadata scope. We also have the read-only scope, which is a little bit more permissive. Do you want to go into that?
Yeah, so the difference there is that you can also download files.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see what the title is, you can see the size of the file, but the application can download files. Can you think of an example when that might be used?
One example where that might be used is if the application loop wanted to have the ability to make a collage of all of the photos in your drive, but didn't want to save the collage back to drive. An application that wants to perform some function on the files there, but not actually write anything back. So in this case, a loop would have to collect the drive.readonly scope. They'd have to go through all of the images in your drive, and they would download each image. And then given that, they would be able to make a collage. This is where the example use case ends, though, because a loop actually also wants to be able to save the generated collage back into your drive. So this scope alone is not good enough for them.
So for something like an application that would back up all your drive, or create, say you select a few files and you'd like to make an archive from those files,
Right.
and just download that zipped archive. Something like that would be perfectly good with this scope.
There's a lot of enterprise use cases for this, for instance, like enterprise audits or enterprise, like let's suppose somebody leaves a company or somebody needs to back up all of their stuff from Google Drive into the company's filer. Things like this are very good for the read-only scope. There's no reason those applications need to write anything to your drive.
Absolutely. And we mentioned users being happy to give you access to the data. It also applies to domain administrators as well. So a domain administrator is much more likely to allow users on their domain to use your application if you use quite a narrow scope like this one.
Exactly. So to give also an example of readonly.metadata, an example where somebody might use this is if they were implementing their own picker, right? You want to show the user a list of all of the files in their drive, and for some reason the application has decided not to use the picker that we provide. Maybe, for instance, a picker on an embedded system like a printer can't display our HTML5 picker. So instead they generate their own picker and allow the user to select a file from Drive. In that case, you don't need to download the files. All you need really is like the title and type of file so that the user can see those things and choose one. And then once the user chooses that, you also have the file's ID, and then you can use that to do other things. So the two other scopes that we're going to talk about today are the drive and drive.file scope. I actually think it might be easier to talk about the drive scope first.
I think so.
Yeah.
So the drive scope's really easy. It allows the application access to do just about anything the user can do to their drive.
Yeah.
There's no restriction on that, and that is equivalent to the scope that you would get for the documents list API.
Exactly.
I mean, it's so equivalent, in fact, that you can use a token from the documents list API that you got with Drive API. That's useful for people who have migrated and they don't want to reauthorize the user.
Yeah. So with that scope, you can do anything possible with the SDK. Every single feature is available to you. Now, that's not to say that you should use that scope. You should use the least amount of access that you need. And actually, that's where the drive.file scope comes in. That's the most important scope, I think. Because what this scope allows your application to do is access files like their metadata and download them and manipulate them that the application has either created or opened. So if I have this scope and I create some file, if I upload a file to Drive, I now have full control over that file. I can update it, I can download it, I can delete it if I need to.
And you can list it.
And I can list it, right.
So it's a slightly subtle difference. It's the user authorizes your application first, but then you have to have some kind of user input that the user will explicitly say, I will allow this application to use this file.
Right.
For example, clicking in the Drive UI, or from the picker, or from Android, these kind of situations, the user makes an explicit choice. So it's kind of like a filter on the Drive scope.
Yeah. So the drive.file scope is used primarily by applications who need to only manage their own set of files. They don't need to import any data or manipulate any data in the rest of the user's drive. They just want to take some set of files and manage them in Drive.
Yes. So we have some examples, don't we?
Yeah. What's an example?
So take Balsamiq. I don't know if you've used Balsamiq. It's a mock-up editor. You create mock-ups for your new website or your GUI application, whatever it is. They have their own file format, BMML. And those files really are no use to any application other than Balsamiq. One day, if they're huge, maybe there'll be other people who open that kind of file. So that's really useful for them. When they get a list of the files, they only get a list of those files. They can create those files, they can read them, they can do whatever they like with them, but it's kind of a subset of the drive.
Yeah. So really here, Balsamiq is a good citizen. Like, they're a good application in that they are requesting the least amount of permissions that they actually need. They could use the full scope, but they choose not to because it's better for users.
And something we haven't mentioned much is that you can combine these scopes. So Balsamiq, if they wanted to just list the titles and be able to find which files are actually Balsamiq files, looking at all of them, they could request the readonly.metadata scope with the file scope. So they could say, be able to list all the titles and only open the ones and save the ones that the user explicitly allows.
Exactly.
So mix and match. I mean, they're specifically designed to be atomic, so you can take little bits of them and join them together and use whatever you like.
Yeah. So in the full scope, it's also important to note that another application with the full scope could see Balsamiq's files, right? So if Balsamiq is creating all of their BMML files and accessing those with the drive.file scope, and another application comes in and the user authorizes it, that other application could actually impact those BMML files. So it's important also when you're working with these scopes to realize that you're not the only application working with the user's files.
Right.
There's the Google Drive UI. A user could come in and move files or delete them or do whatever. And then a user could authorize another application to do the same thing. So there's no way to have a locked section or a locked folder of files that are only accessible by your application at the moment.
Yeah.
So that's kind of something we're considering, but at the moment we don't have anything.
So this brings us back full circle to the first thing you said, Vic, is that this is all for users.
Yeah.
And the user owns these data. The user owns the files. The user can say, anyone can open this file, whatever. On a regular file system, you wouldn't really lock it down per application. You would lock it down for the username or whatever system you're using.
Yeah, exactly. So we're very fond of this permission structure. And in the future, as we add more and more features to the SDK, I suspect that we'll make much heavier use of scopes so that your application can request just the access that it needs. So you should really look forward to the future in which we expose other scopes to do other things.
Absolutely. And as we said, very fine-grained scoping as well.
Yeah. We've even received a number of feature requests on adding more fine-grained scopes, like being able to add a scope, for instance, by file type. Like, what if I only want to access the images in a user's drive? That's a very good idea.
Yes, compelling use case.
Yeah, so I think it's something we're considering implementing. But that is a pretty good summary, I think, of how to use these scopes. If you want to play around with these scopes, you can go to the OAuth 2.0 playground, which is linked right here at the bottom of this page. And you can request the different scopes and see what the OAuth dialog will look like for the user when they're requesting or granting access to your application. You can see how severe the messaging is and things like that.
Obviously, we try and make the messaging more severe the broader the scope. We don't want to scare users away, but at the same time, we do want to be absolutely transparent and honest in what the user is allowing you to do.
Exactly.
So again, the less you use, the less you ask for, the less scary it will look for the user.
Exactly.
And we are getting to a place where users are starting to look through this stuff. I mean, a few years ago, you could have said, people don't read that, they just click OK. But people do read that, and people do care.
Yeah. We've definitely noticed a huge increase in like, time spent on that page reading through these things, and users pay attention. So,
okay.
All right. I guess that's about it for Google Drive OAuth scopes.
Great. Thank you very much, everyone.
We will see you all next week. And thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.
Bye.